So hey, how you doing?
Doing really good, bro. How are you?
Pretty good. You said you had a guest over.
Yeah, I had a friend over. Can I say what I said earlier in DM?
Uh, I I don't know what you're referring to, but I don't think you said anything in DMs you can't say in public.
Okay. I'm a little bit high right now, so like I'm a bit buggy, right? This isn't gonna be a debate. Okay, this is gonna be a conversation, a clash of
What do you keep talking about?
intellectual,
This is
in
debate. This is gonna be a
intellect
blowout. This is blood sports, okay? Mixed. The only thing that's gonna be
blood
mixed
sports.
here is your blood with the
Probably gonna
sand, okay? You're gonna be the gladiator floor. I'm doing the thumbs
we
down. You
probably
call.
agree on like 70% of things, bro, and I can empirically show that.
Okay, 70%. Okay, what's that 70%? The
70%.
70% is like don't kill people. Okay, buddy.
I was talking about housing. I don't think we could agree on that.
Um. All right.
What?
No, I was just thinking. So let's do the intro shill or whatever. So why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and where people can find you?
Okay. Um, I literally only have a Twitter account, but I'm
Hmm.
kind of like a part of the whole like, yeah, I have a Twitter account. I kind of refer to myself as a liberal or like a neoliberal. A lot of people call me sock dem-ish.
Hmm.
I think that if I were to be a sock dem, I would be like quite a moderate slash right
You'd be a
wing
third
sock dem. Like,
way Sockdam or a new Democrat, new
uh,
and Labor sort of
yeah,
Sockdam.
yeah, yeah, yeah. A new Democrat more than like Labor third way.
Ugh,
But yeah,
disgusting.
somewhere around there, bro.
Okay.
However, I like to think that I hold some pretty progressive views, but at the same time, I hold like very like quote unquote like libertarian on very specific issues, libertarian views on certain things as well. So yeah.
Sure. So on that note, um, if you want to follow Mixed on Twitter, I will post their link in chat. They're decently smart. Are you a friend with Mouthy? I thought that's where I first found you, right? Mouthy Infidel.
Yes, bro. Yes, I've been friends with Mouthy for a few years.
So do you think it's possible for liberals and like grifting lefters like Mouthy, right, leftists to be friends, right? Or do you think it's impossible? Do you think in this new age, right, there's no friendship across political lines?
I think that actually back when we became friends was like 2 years ago now, right? I was like a super hardcore, like libertarian Austrian economics, 16-year-old BT, that kind of stuff, right?
Really?
And Mouthy was, yeah, 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 a while ago. And then Mouthy was like borderline tanky,
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep, that's why
ever
he's got the
since then, it's
Ushanka,
kind of,
right?
I mean, like, that's where it
Uh,
comes from. He's like a sockdom at this point, but it's like when we met, he was
bro.
like a tanky. Like he wasn't actually tanky, but he was like
Mm-hmm.
he was one of those like the Nordics aren't socialism. Socialism's the abolition of the commodity form, or like leftcom would probably be a lot more accurate. But now we've both come a lot more to the center.
Yeah, you've brought together each other, right? This is synthesis and
Yeah, that's what I'm saying,
synthesis,
bro.
antithesis.
Listen,
Um,
I made him embrace markets. He made me embrace like welfare. Okay, so it's like that.
well, so I guess on that, one, uh, it's really distracting me to hear your phone noise, but it's okay. I
Oh
have
wait,
the
yeah,
ability to
sorry,
cut
bro.
it.
Let me just mute that.
Well, I was gonna make a joke about it being your guest or whatever, but that could be inappropriate for the
Oh
stream.
no, bro. Listen, it was a friend. Okay, bro.
Okay,
Listen,
just a friend, bro. Just a friend.
bro. Listen, bro. I don't. It's not like that, bro.
Um, so why don't we start with I guess let's move to the meat of it. So, what would you describe in broad terms as your position on like let's do even the broader terms. So, what would you call yourself like in general? Like what is your economic theory of how things work? I noticed on Twitter you called yourself a monetarist. I don't Do you want
Yeah,
to
yeah.
clarify that?
So okay, so this is specifically like only when it. Okay, so very broadly, right? I really focus a lot on like monetary policy. So that's things like Federal Reserve policy, things like federal like repo rate, interest rates, how money is injected into the society, like how like nominal variables and real variables interact with So that's my
Mhm.
forte, right? And I
Yeah,
personally
cuz you're
believe
an
that
Austrian, okay?
like I
That's all they care
no,
about.
I'm
That's all
not an
they ever talk
Austrian.
about.
Nope.
No, no, no.
No,
That's
not an
that's where you
Austrian.
came from. You were socialized as an Austrian, so the only thing you care about is money, okay, and how much there is of it. Okay.
Money matters. Money is important. Okay, so basically, I'm a market monetarist, which is pretty
Mm,
much like the whole like Scott Sumner, David Beckworth, Lars Christensen kind of gang. We believe that the Federal Reserve, instead of like targeting inflation rate, should actually be targeting a nominal GDP variable,
mm-hmm.
and you can take that into consideration. Nominal GDP level targeting, which forecasts the trend line. So in that respect, I think that I would be relatively like quite right wing when it comes to like my views on like monetary economics, right?
Why
So I
would
think that like
targeting NGDP make you right wing on monetary economics? I know very little about
so
monetary policy. I focus almost
yeah,
entirely on fiscal. I'm the other direction. So
that in itself isn't at all, right?
okay.
But then there's also like the general idea of like, okay, how do we get an economy out of recession, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a market monetarist, I think that monetary policy is infinitely more powerful and more effective. That doesn't have the same political and time constraints as fiscal policies. So I would personally say that I don't believe in expansionary fiscal policy to
Mm.
increase nominal spending within the economy whatsoever, right? And instead, I would prefer purely to monetary policy when it comes to expansionary policy. Yeah,
I feel like
and
we could
that's
have a
considered somewhat
whole
right wing.
I was just going to say, I feel like we could have a whole conversation on that because I was just reading, and I'm saying that to say that we shouldn't have it because we should have the conversation about housing instead. But I guess
Yeah,
my closing thought on that would just be there was a really interesting paper by the IMF of all sorts, which was arguing that
yeah,
austerity had actually had enormous negative effects because large declines in fiscal spending had had enormous negative growth effects because they seriously underestimated the Keynesian multiplier of fiscal spending. Um, so
my understanding
maybe
is
we can debate this in like another time perhaps because I am
we
not
can
at
talk
all
about
versed on
this
monetary
later,
stuff.
definitely.
I can't debate this. If you would like,
No, no,
actually,
we should.
let me note this in DMs for a less high version of you to send me like
Yeah,
some papers from Sumner or whatever. Send me on a
amazing, amazing. And okay, so basically, this isn't to say that fiscal policy has no effect, right? Fiscal policy that is like big enough, that's big enough and actually like targets how it's spending its money to, you know, really like have the highest level of like fiscal multiplier as possible, right?
mm-hmm.
Is obviously going to have some effect. The only thing that like quote unquote like market monitors believe is that monetary policy is just like a far
Okay.
better tool. But we can get into that later. Housing.
Yeah, so housing is like a purely fiscal thing, as far as I can. Like maybe it interacts a little bit with like monetary stuff, but as I understand it, it's like it's on the fiscal side. So to move
Oh
into
yeah,
that,
yeah. Well,
sorry.
it's really both because you get into like
Oh my
housing
god.
interest rates, mortgage payments, blah blah blah. But that's like irrelevant.
So, regardless of how we want to approach it, what would you say that your position on like housing in general is? Like, I guess in broadest senses, like how should we decide who gets housing? What should be the role of the state in that? In very broad terms.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, are you
I
asking
am
me like
asking
how
you.
I believe
Yes.
that the org? Okay. Okay. So housing is one of those like extremely regional kind of like things, right? There's
hmm
certain places in the world that it's like they have suited geography or they have like suited like political history, right? In which like different forms of housing could be really useful. So when you have countries like, for example, or like regions or whatever you want to call them, city states like Singapore and Hong Kong, which have a very large population and a very small landmass,
hmm
it seems to make sense that certain forms of like large public housing tends to be somewhat preferable to that of like pure market housing, right? And this is due to like a number of geographical reasons and a number of like different like political history reasons, right? But then you also have cities like, for example, Austin and Houston, which have like
hmm
a lot of land. They have like histories of like good zoning reforms and good land use regulations, in
hmm
which it seems like it would be cheaper and more effective to like allow private companies build apartment buildings and like low income rental apartments, and just like like have a program of like different like sort of like rent assistance and like rent subsidization, right?
So I guess my counter response, right, to put the same burden on me, is I guess my
Yeah.
view is that ideally I want. You didn't fully answer the first question, and I will give you a moment for that. I think that housing should be provided to all, I think it's one of those things where like you need equality of outcome there, that everyone should get housing, and it's particularly not actually for the adults, it's for the children. Every child deserves a house, and as a result you should make sure that every adult has a house so that every adult is able in like a stable position to raise a child. It also seems like it has like crime benefits and other social benefits, but we can get into that in a moment. And I presume everyone's going to say that everyone deserves a house. The question is that mostly on the second one, how should the state, if at all, intervene to do that? Because some people think the market is going to get the most people housed as possible. Um,
Right.
my take is that the state, it seems like we have very positive examples of social housing, even in countries like Finland. That's the example that I would point to. And even in the United States, where you have highly, what's the name for it? So in Finland, a lot of the social housing is highly concentrated, but in America, most of these so-called housing first programs, and also in Canada, most of the so-called housing first programs have been. I want to say they're called like dispersed housing. It's literally that they'll just like buy random units or rent random units. It won't be like one singular house or something. Um, so I guess I'm not entirely sure, and I won't. We can go into that in more detail, but I'm not entirely sure that it's true that there's like this disjunct that it like social housing works in cities, but it doesn't work in like more suburban areas. And I guess if you're, I guess you are trying to draw a distinction between social housing and like renting private housing, but it seems like there's no fundamental reason why we would expect social housing to be that very different than like renting a house. I guess fundamentally, that's the way I think about it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
Sorry. Just to clarify, I don't think there is a difference either. They're technically both rental apartments, and
mhm,
also the thing I was talking about, like different geographies. I was kind of more meaning like what is like more cost effective, right?
mhm.
So in spaces where land is incredibly expensive and it's really hard to like acquisition land
Like
in different
Singapore.
ways,
Yeah.
like Singapore exactly, it's so much easier for the state or like for the local government just to own certain like plots of land where they could like develop and like get their own rent money, right? But it seems to places like in Houston, it's like reliable that like private contractors and like private firms and private what are they called again, like landowners, like
Landlords.
I'm Swedish. Yeah, I'm Swedish, so I don't really know the best word for
It's
it, but
okay. We
whatever.
understand that you
Um,
Europors have like a just a fundamentally broken understanding of like both science and the English language. We understand.
Wrong, bro. That's just wrong. Listen.
If Siamese in
So it
chat,
just seems
okay, it's
like
not just Swedes, it's Finns too.
oh my
Wake
god.
up, liberal.
But it just seems cheaper
Hello?
for local governments to like pay rent assistance, right?
Hmm.
Because they have like such different like supply of housing and like the regulatory capture that exists.
So, it's possible that this could be true. I haven't read much comparative literature on the efficacy of types of social housing in different densities. So I can't just like prove you wrong on this one. I definitely think that what you're
No, of
saying about
course not. Yeah.
I was just going to say I agree with it. What you said about Singapore, there was a really neat article about. And before I say this, I want people to know I'm not trying to defend the USSR. There was a really neat article about like housing in the USSR, and one of the really big benefits that the USSR had is because the state owned all the land, they didn't need to deal with like there's one guy who's holding out on selling his property or whatever. They could just force people to do it, and it made large construction very easy. And so I think that the example you point to in Singapore is like one of those prime examples where if there's like a whole bunch of tiny landlords, it makes it very hard to build these enormous apartment buildings that you need in highly dense cities. And so there might be some utility of having the state have that power to come in and just force people to cooperate. Um, but that might be less of an issue if there's just abundant land, right? I guess is your point.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Which is also like goes into my next argument, which is kind of like it's so I read this really interesting paper in this article, which kind of
Mm-hmm.
like described developed countries' policies and attitudes to how to solve like housing crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So between the 50s up to the 70s, governments throughout both Europe and
Is
North
that the paper?
America.
Brief
They,
interjection. Is that the paper you sent me before, or is it another one?
uh, no, it's
No,
another.
it's
It's another
another
one I
one.
can
Yeah,
send
no.
it to you.
Yeah, you
Yeah, yeah.
better. Okay, I want
They
these
were really
links.
they were
Where
they
to
were really
linky?
focusing on yo, listen, they're really focusing on all like the like building public housing, right?
Yeah.
That decrease slightly the cost of rent and housing and increase the supply of housing.
Mm-hmm.
More people were but then after that, during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, they switched over to rent assistance instead of building
Mm-hmm.
public housing, right? But the problem is, at that same time, land use regulations and like zoning made it a lot harder for
NIMBYism,
private
right?
companies. Yeah, exactly. For private like developers to come in, and especially for low income developments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was government was giving out loans and giving out like rental assistance, which increased the demand of housing,
Hmm.
but land use regulations and zoning
Decrease the supply.
kept steady the supply. The only
Yeah.
thing that ended up happening was that rent became so much more expensive, right?
Hmm.
And people didn't actually become like better housed. There was a study in the UK, and I can send you this too. Half of the benefits, like half of the actual cash that was given to tenants, went straight to the landlords instead.
Just reminding myself of the studies to demand from you later.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So I can totally believe that. I think that I am part of like the YIMBY or whatever group on Twitter, right? I want like less land usage. There was actually recently in the United States, I think not for San Francisco, Los
California,
Angeles?
they
It wasn't
removed
California. It was
like
Los Angeles in particular. Removed all of their single family zoning requirements, literally all of them, and now you can build up
yeah,
to I think a quadruplex or something in every lot in the city, which is really good. And so I think there's a lot of evidence that stuff like that seems to help, like that NIMBYism stuff really depresses the supply of housing. The I guess the main disagreement that we might be having is the utility of social housing construction versus simply just paying the market, right? Which is better, having
yeah,
state-owned like construction firms fundamentally, or state-subsidized construction firms, or just subsidizing consumers. Um,
right.
and so I guess the two ways to approach this are, so I think the argument for the subsidizing consumers thing is twofold, and I'll defend this even though I think this is your position, and then I'll let you speak about it, and then I will pivot to the other one. I think the argument for this is twofold. One, it's administratively very easy. You just send people checks. You're literally, it's like Section 8 in the United States. You just give people money. Literally, you just give people money. It's that simple. So that's easy, and you can just let the market deal with it. And if you believe that the market is generally more efficient than state-owned firms, which I'm sure you probably do, given your background, then probably there's an efficiency gain. So not only do you spend less on administration, but you get like a 2% gain because it's the market instead of the state, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I generally agree with that, among other things. But sure, yeah.
So then I guess the argument in the converse for social housing, the two arguments there is that, so the first one is returning a bit to like that, it's how do I put this? The first argument is a sort of social planning sort of argument, which I think it reads a little bit totalitarian or dystopic, but it like to return to like that to that USSR thing. One of the really neat ideas that come out of the USSR was building standardized houses and building so-called micro districts. Micro districts are a really neat idea where nowadays it's called walkable cities, where every service you need is within walkable distance to you. And so like ideally, like every city in the USSR was this sort of like plop down template where like you'd have like a nursery within walkable distance, you'd have a kindergarten within walkable distance, you'd have a middle school within walkable distance, you'd have a doctor's office within walkable distance, you'd have a high school within walkable distance, on and on and on and on. You'd have all of these things designed in just the right place. And the concern is that if you leave it to private developers, that might not happen, that people might not naturally put things in the quote unquote correct places. I guess it was one of the fundamental arguments, or rather that the state can do it more efficiently because they do have the ability to do that and they do benefit from that. It's like an example of an externality, right? Like the developer only benefits a little bit from having more expensive land because they put a school there, but the state benefits a lot because it has like healthier people and it has reduced transportation and it like benefits from better education in society in general. So that's kind of the take there. That's the first argument. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but or if that can be solved another way
Yeah,
that I
no,
haven't thought of.
definitely. I mean, like micro districts you're talking about, that is something that is unbelievably common in the Nordics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So personally, I live in Sweden, and we have like within every single city, like depending on the size, we'll have a like 5 to 10 different like torries, right? TORJ. Like we have like Frölunda Torg, Utskruktstorgen, and they're basically
Chat, if
exactly
he's
the
saying
same, right?
anything that's banned, okay, let me know.
No, bro. Oh my God. Listen, that's literally like imagine it's kind of like a super small, concentrated city town. You'd have like a daycare center. You'd have a grocery store. You'd have a
Mm-hmm.
dentist. You'd have like it's like a in Sweden we have like a vårdcentral, which is like a small hospital, and they
Mm-hmm.
exist in every single
A
one of those,
clinic.
right?
That's what we call it in the US.
Clinic,
Yeah.
yeah, clinic,
Mm-hmm.
sure, yeah, yeah, yeah. And you would have like pretty much everything you would need
Mm-hmm.
for life. You wouldn't have to leave there if you really didn't want to, right?
So I guess the
And
question then
it
is, sorry, go ahead,
Yeah,
finish.
yeah. Sorry, and these things all either happen naturally or they happen through like somewhat state intervention, right?
Hmm.
So they take like populated neighborhoods and they would buy out this like little piece of land in the middle and develop it until it could be like a small shopping center with everything you needed. So these things can exist either naturally, as a lot of places in Sweden, like they just spring up because people want them,
Sure.
or the state can just buy little plots of land and create those little things without having to create standardized housing throughout the entire district. So it's just, yeah.
Sure. So I guess then the question that the proposal you're suggesting is rather than doing like the full scale sort of USSR, just the state is the entire construction firm. It's more akin to, hey, maybe the state has like buys up some land. It's like it's a moderate position, I suppose. Technically, it's somewhere
Yeah,
in
so it's like
between.
we can
Hmm.
recreate a lot of the same social goods and like good neighborhood effects that through to a lot lesser degree of like state intervention and state planning.
So I guess the question then is that actually efficient? So one of the relevant questions here is like when the state so like this is totally like orthogonal to housing, but do you know anything about like the cheapness of construction of nuclear plants? Or is this going to be totally like irrelevant to you?
I don't know anything about it, but I'm sure I'll understand any analogy you
Sure.
use.
So there's this really neat article about the construction of nuclear power plants, like fission plants. Let me go get it. Nuclear pow. Um, so, and I guess I'll show the graph to people on stream as well. So it can be hard to get it without like looking at it for a little bit. Oh, and the graph is so tiny and disgusting. What the fuck happened? Why is it so gross?
Data construction.
Okay, here's a bigger version of the graph.
Okay. Oh, so the U.S.
So the date of construction is just showing when it happened. And so one of the things
Right.
that you see is over time, the dark blue is the USA. And the cost of construction, the overnight construction cost, or OCC, basically means the cost to get from like empty plot of land to you start up the reactor. That's what it means.
Yeah.
I know. And so it's also called what's called the turnkey cost, like when you're literally turning the key and like so in the United States, it went from like $1,000
Right.
per like kilowatt, and then it rapidly shot upwards, and then we basically didn't build
Uh,
any more after the 70s. And in other countries that was not the experience. So in India and Japan and South Korea, the cost stayed relatively linear and flat. And while France was building them, the cost also stayed relatively flat. So the dark red is France. That's one of the other really big builders of nuclear power, and you can see it was going up, but it was going up from like, I don't know, 1,200 to like 2,000 slowly
like
over time.
3,000.
Yeah. Um, and one of the big things that South Korea and Japan and France all did is they had state construction firms, which they would build in parallel. Literally, what they would do in France is they would build double or quadruple nuclear power plants. So they would take one like design of a plant and literally rotate it 90 degrees and build it again, and then rotate it 90 degrees and build it again, and then rotate it 90 degrees and build it again. Um, and it seemed like that led to like enormous efficiency gains because you had the same construction crew doing the same thing over and over and over again. You didn't have these one-off projects, which was exactly how we did in the United States. Every individual nuclear power plant was a different plan by a different construction crew. And there's many other causes of these cost rises, but this is like one of the big ones that they point to. So I guess I'm
Right.
wondering if there could actually be a benefit to having a standardized construction plan. I guess is the very simple overview that I'm trying to get at. What if there is a utility of having construction crews who are used to building a certain kind of neighborhood, a certain kind of housing, which I'm sure to some
Yeah.
degree private are, but I'm just sorry. I'll put it to you then. That was my ramble.
Yeah, absolutely. This really just sounds more of an issue of like how do I say smart government foresight and
Hmm.
like economies of scale, right? So, for
Basically, yeah.
example, I really don't think that like a lot of the how do I say if every single nuclear plant in France, Canada, West Germany, Japan, India, South Korea were all built by like single state construction firms, right? Oftentimes, what happens is like you would have like let's say a template that is owned and created by like uh, engineers and different like sort of like people that work within the government, right?
Hmm.
And they would contract out these projects with like standardized blueprints and everything to the same private company, just build it multiple times, right? And we do this
Sure,
for a lot of we do this for like government buildings, prisons. We do it for like police stations, everything here in Sweden, right?
sure.
It just kind of seems like in the United States, each individual how to say each individual plant was like different or like just like built inefficiently, right? So to me, this sounds more like a lot of a problem. This sounds a lot more of a problem of like poor government planning than like the any efficiency gain created by like a single uh construction company.
So someone in chat says, and this is true, I believe, that every nuclear power plant in France was built by Areva SA, which was a majority state-owned French construction company. So I don't. The other countries could be totally wrong. Um, but
No, no, that's
my
totally
point
possible.
my point, no, no, no. So my point is not to say like state-owned good or whatever. The point here was I'm trying to agree with you about the economies of scale sort of thing. The question then is just fundamentally about whether, so like there's a difference in a state buying a plot of land and having to figure out how to develop it into like the central like communal hub or whatever, and kind of plopping it down beforehand and it already being like that and not having to think about how to retrofit things that already exist. And so I guess that's the only thought process that I have there. What if there's a benefit to having a social plan that you can lay down for like 30 years down the road rather than having to come into this disorganized social plan and have to retrofit it to something that's useful? Um,
Yeah,
like I,
absolutely. But where would you do that through zoning? So basically, city planners can literally just say, okay, we're planning on building this new like center, like planning on building this new part of the city, right? We do it all the time. You lay out a map. You say in this district, this district, this district, this is the type of house you're allowed to build.
mhm,
These districts, you have to build this for like, for example, a shopping center. This has to be allocated for like this public utility, right? And I'm saying that's already completely possible through just having like a zoning plan, which most cities
sure.
already do when they're like opening up new neighborhoods and stuff.
Maybe. I mean, the big fear in the United States, I suppose, is that this is very much not the experience. Most suburbs in the United States are atrocious. They are literally they're just housing. And then, like, if you picture an American city as being like half a mile of housing in either direction, and then there's this one big road
Right.
with like a little strip of commercial on both sides of the road. That is like the
Right.
fundamental structure of every town in America. Um, it is bad. It's real bad. And to some degree, I think that's when you leave it up to like market forces. To some degree, that's like and to some degree, that's also a failure of local governments as well. So maybe that's just me not liking the American experience with it. Maybe in other countries they do it better. So I don't know. Um,
Yeah, it feels like a lot of this like really poor planning seems to be like not always unique, but like somewhat unique to the United States. Because here in Sweden, it feels like we here in Europe we have a lot of like mixed zoning, right?
mhm.
So you'd have like apartment buildings in the same buildings as like little like corner stores. You would have like supermarkets in the same buildings as like at a residential area, just like on top. And it seems like a lot of this just seems to be like poor backwards zoning laws than something that is like that would be more efficient or more cheaper to just like do like full state how do I say like state-owned enterprises like doing all the construction and everything.
Maybe. I guess I'm just not. I just don't know. I genuinely don't know. Like I know that one of the other considerations here is like there could be cyclicality too. There's like another major consideration in market economies that like a firm during a recession could just not get orders, for example, and they might go out of business, and you kind of scatter the talent to the winds. But if it's a state-owned firm, you can just subsidize it. Again, maybe you can possibly do that just via subsidizing firms in general, right? Like maybe you don't need to have it state-owned. It just seems like sometimes there are these like efficiency gains, these like paperwork gains, administrative gains of just straight up owning it. These like sort of essential sort of things. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, and that might absolutely be true, but that would be really like as in the beginning of the conversation, somewhat case by case, right? It seems like
Maybe.
in countries where this sort of things like already happen just like naturally, like pretty
Well,
well, like Sweden or the other Nordic countries. But then it could also be that if you really wanted that type of neighborhood in throughout your entire city, then I'm sure that there's certain circumstances where you have efficiency gains and like lower costs by doing that instead.
so I guess I don't really know how much more I have to say about this particular like the public versus private like state like construction firm ownership because I just don't have studies on this in
Right.
particular. Um,
Right.
most of the studies I have on like private versus public ownership, and maybe this is something you can provide studies on as well, seem to indicate that they're like roughly comparable. The one study that I looked at, which did like this big review of a whole bunch of privatized firms, found that generally firms which are heavily subsidized did pretty poorly. After they were privatized, and then firms which are lightly subsidized generally did pretty well after they were privatized, suggesting that like
Right.
certain kinds of firms might just not be profitable in the market, and the state might either need to permanently subsidize them or just own them.
Yeah,
And then the question
absolutely.
is simply which is more efficient, right? There's like an administrative gain perhaps if it's state
Different
owned.
industries, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
No, and this is something that's definitely true. However, it seems like the state seems to be really good at doing a lot of different stuff. For example, education, healthcare, and different like kind of like large scales like public utilities like
Mm-hmm.
water, electricity, blah blah blah. But it really does seem to be that one thing the state or local governments for some reason just generally seem to be really really bad at, and that seems to be property management, right? So if you look at, for
This could
example,
almost be
things
an
like
argument for doing it at the federal level, right? Like like taking it out of the
yeah,
hands.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It absolutely could be, absolutely, but then that you would have
Mm.
to get into the argument, it's like, will that really happen with how, like, zoning laws are currently treated like, the
Yeah.
United States, right? In Japan, they have federal or, like, federal, zoning, seems to be
Hmm.
working out really, really great.
Interesting.
It's kinda like in the US, it's gonna be a really hard, tough road before we can start, like, proposing, like, federally zoned housing or federally zoned land,
All right.
you know?
Added to more studies to
There's this
pester
one
you that.
sorry. Yeah,
Go ahead.
amazing. I'll send you all of these. Okay. So another thing that I read, right? It was a article and a link to the study. And I'll find it right here.
Well.
So basically, it's like this monitor's report of like public housing quality
Mm-hmm.
in New York City, right? And there's this guy called Bart Schwartz who did this like wait, I'll send it to you right now, which gives like this like yearly report on the state of public housing. Like, how good are they? What are the amenities like? What are like how much shit is broken? Stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be his conclusion is that for some reason, local governments, especially in New York City, are just so inept, and there's such a like a misalignment of like hierarchies and like taking things for responsibility that
Mm-hmm.
they just seem to be really inefficient at managing property, right? So a lot of property wasn't like properly dealt with. There's a lot of like not repairs done. It was just like run down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a lot of places that were like kept too well, right? Like there was too many resources being kept on it. So it
Hmm.
seems like local governments just seem to not be very good at property management. And I sent the article here in chat.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I'll have to read it over. I can't read it over in the moment. Um,
Right. Of course.
the So I could totally believe this, and to me, these all seem like arguments for economies of scale sort of arguments. How is it that private companies can manage properties well? Well, it's because it's their one job, and it's like the only thing they do, and often they're pretty large firms and have like experience doing so, or else they like lose out on that. But local governments
Right.
often don't have expertise doing that. It's like totally unrelated to that, and so to me, this almost seems like again the argument for like almost do the same thing but at a higher level, literally like have HUD run it instead of having the local. I don't know if you would HUD. HUD is the Housing and Urban Development Department in the United States. Like
Right.
have HUD run it rather than having the local communities run it to some degree.
Right.
Um,
That, that could absolutely be true. I don't have any studies on that though. I feel that oftentimes it just feels like property
well,
management just seems like something that just like is inherently so local, right? Like the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development isn't going to know like what the like what the proper like method of like cleaning out a rat infestation in like some neighborhood, right? So it
well,
seems like either
sure, but
way,
like
no matter
the same sort of
it
thing. I
totally
think
yeah.
I think the same sort of thing would apply to like most property management firms CEOs, right? Like the CEO of a property management thing has no idea what any individual building is like. Instead, it's the employees in that location which know what it's like, and they just report up the chain. That's sort of
Right.
literally the Hayek local knowledge problem, right? Is that like literally no one at the top of these companies knows how the local operations are. They're just running it from atop.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. But it just seems like for some reason, like publicly, as we know right now, the only thing that this like study is kind of shows us is that local governments tend to be pretty bad, right?
mhm.
And then we can kind of have a conversation of like how much better would it be improved if it were to be like done federally instead.
Sure, I would need to read more into that. I guess the main counter example that I would point to is the Finnish experience.
Yeah.
So I don't have data on
Oh,
the quality of Finnish housing, but it seemed like the
right.
so in Finland. They use a mixture of social housing and social housing construction by a state-owned firm called the Y Foundation, and the Y Foundation is actually pretty big. It's the fourth largest landowner in Finland. It's actually pretty big,
Right.
and as I recall, let me go get the exact stats on it. Housing. Uh, I just wanted to. I don't want to misrepresent it. Um,
You know.
oh no, that's a general thing. So they say, and this is just a quote from like the director, so it's not anything formal. But quote, we own much of the land. We have a zoning monopoly, which I guess is part of what you're talking about. We run our own construction company that helps a lot with housing first, because simply there's no way that you will eradicate homeless without a serious big picture housing policy. Um, I think more generally, I guess I would just point to the fact that a whole lot of the housing that they own and operate is like state owned and state run, and it seems like they've basically ended homelessness. Now, I don't know whether it's cost effective, and I don't know whether the private sector could run better. Again, I don't have those comparative studies, and I'm not sure even that the study that you're looking at is going to provide solid comparative evidence. I probably would need a formal study on this, but
Right. No, I completely agree. I think that it does make sense. I mean, like it could be wrong. However, it does make a little bit of intuitive sense that if you're gonna have like, for example, like a homeless eradication policy, you're
mhm.
not gonna expect
Which
those homeless
sounds.
people to pay rent, right?
Can I just say, homeless eradication policy sounds like the purge. It sounds like you're paying people to go out with like shotguns and eradicate the homeless.
What are you
But
talking about, bro? Didn't you see that fucking amazing poster by the conservatives in the UK? We're gonna cut homeless people in half.
that was so. Oh my god.
You
Um,
talk. I don't even know how you understand that. Anyways, it seems like if you're gonna have like large scale housing policies, it's probably cheaper in the long run to pay for the construction of it and then just hold that land without having to pay rent, for like a very, very long time. So it
well, it
seems like
could
if you
be.
want to like give,
Go ahead.
could
I keep
be.
interrupting.
No, no, it could be.
I mean, I guess
Go on.
the only thought there is like I guess the other related concept to me that I'm a little um one fear of mine, I guess, is just like one of the difficulties I was looking at is like there's this administrative difficulty of having to deal with the paperwork of like buying a housing, like this apparently in the Swedish model, apparently they sometimes do, and you have to like go through all the paperwork of working with like the local vendor or whatever, the local housing owner. And instead, if you just directly purchase the land and directly operate it, it seems like you cut out the middleman essentially. There's like one layer of paperwork eliminated. It's literally the concept is called vertical integration in general.
Right.
And so I'm just not sure. Again, I don't have solid enough evidence on this. All that I've read about is that it seems like, and I guess we're fundamentally agreeing on this. It seems like anti-homelessness policies of just like giving people money and otherwise subsidizing housing are really, really effective. Um,
And this is
so
obviously not even taking into consideration like other institutions that should exist in society for homeless people. Injection
sure.
room seems to be pretty good. Like better, like how do we say, mental health facilities teams seem to be better. There's a lot of like primary things we can do before homelessness is, how do I say, even even like people even before they become homeless that you can do.
Well, so I guess one of the things is there's a study that I haven't read yet, but while I was doing research for this, another so there's a program in the United States run by HUD, which is a voucher program, and it's not Section 8, which is the main one. It's the Veteran Assistant Housing Program in the United States, and veteran
Right.
homelessness. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, I just said right.
Um, and the HUD VASH program has enormously reduced homelessness. There was this one study, I think yeah, it was Evans 2019, which I thought just had a very funny quote in it. It was reviewing the efficacy of the voucher program, and they say, quote, for each additional voucher, permanent supportive housing units increased by zero point 0.9 and the number of homeless veterans decreased by 1. So that doesn't sound very funny, I guess, without the context. But basically, the question they're trying to ask is, for each voucher you give, how many less homeless are there? And the answer is 1. For each one homeless person you give a voucher for housing, there is one less homeless person. um, which is just, I guess, it's a funny answer, just because it's exactly what you'd expect. Um,
Yeah.
and so I guess these voucher programs do seem to be incredibly effective. So at the very minimum, these do seem to be like at the necessary. I guess the only question from my perspective is, should we go further? Should we like actually have the state ownership of the land? Should we do vertical integration of that kind? I don't know. Um, yeah,
Right.
I can't argue with that, I guess, fully. So even high
Yeah,
mix is BTFOing me, right?
would there be like a decrease in like long run marginal cost if you just owned the land and just didn't charge rent, or if you have to continuously pay rent every month? Yeah, it depends on like how long term the plans also are.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the other concepts here is, and this is even more abstract than like the current conversation, but just like who should own wealth in society. And so I guess one of the other like concerns is that if you, from like a leftist perspective, I understand you don't come from this perspective. From a leftist perspective, there is a concern that if a company or individual owns a whole lot of land and other wealth, they might be able to use that for political gains, either by stuff like evicting people or like controlling their lives or like essentially trying to gain profit over people without consideration of their well-being. And obviously the market has some restrictions on that, right? You can't just like really fuck up people's housing or else they'll just leave. They won't pay you money. But there's, I guess, this concern even more generally. What like the political concern, I guess, is that a lot of concentrated wealth might allow wealthy people to like dominate politics, or wealthy corporations to dominate politics. And so there's this sort of fear that you don't want concentrated wealth, which is one thing I worry about in this sector. Because it's literally land ownership. It's literally just wealth. So
Yeah, but it's like, have we kind of seen like have you seen that really play out in real life though? Like, have you seen like large scales like developing corporations like threatening people's way of life, or well, I mean, like in the way you're saying, like starting to like take over like local like political
I
power and kind of like affecting this sort of stuff.
I mean, so I don't have anecdotes offhand of taking over local political power, but there are, and again, this is anecdotes, so I can't formally cite it, I suppose. Lots of people complain, especially due to rent control, that people, basically how it works, this is like a whole complicated story, but as I understand it, basically how it works is if you evict someone, then in an empty room, you can raise the rent freely. But if a person remains in a room, you can't raise the tenant's rent. And so there are a lot of anecdotes of people complaining that their landlord is basically trying to kick them out so that they can make an empty room so that they can raise the rent so they can get a high income person in the room instead of like their low income ass. And so I don't have formal studies on this. I can't prove this. But it does seem like they certainly don't always have the incentives of like the best interest of the people at heart.
Of course. But then that kind of seems like something that like probably be easier just to have like proper like tenant rights regulations, and like you can even look like
The
that just
problem
seems
with that
something
is
that like
enforcement.
seems like a very that only happens when you live in like quite a corrupt like regulatory environment.
The problem with this though is enforcement. It's that so there's like let's say we're comparing and contrasting. So section situation one, there's a publicly owned housing corporation, right? And so the employee of the state who is in charge of like fixing your toilet also reports to the state. So the state already has all the information that employee can like provide them, right? Because they are the employee of the state. But in the other situation, the employees of a private firm, and so there's like this veil of privacy between what the private employee does and what the state knows. And so to enforce this, you need an additional employee to come in, an employee of the state, to come in like a social worker and to come in and investigate the situation, figure out who's in the right. And so basically the problem is not just like corruption, it's also just like overhead. Basically you need more people, you might need more people to oversee a market than just to directly own it, I guess, is the simplest way of thinking about it.
Okay, so two things. It's kind of like if we're gonna be like talking about like having the appropriate institutions within society to run the type of regulatory environment that tenants would actually be protected in this kind of like a more market-based housing situation. I would say that if we're going to expect those types of institutions to be strong within society, I think that any society that's going to have really strong, non-corrupt, high quality like social housing and public housing would also have to have the same level of like high institutional integrity and like a resources spent on those specific types of institutions. So it seems like either way, the difference would be quite minimal. Or like I haven't seen any evidence or anything to speak
Well,
against that. It seems like in either system, in order to for it to be good, you need to have like large spending on like these institutions to make sure they have integrity.
well, yes, but the question is of how much. So like let's imagine like again the analogy is if we assume that the state owns the firm and they have more information. Let's just assign arbitrary numbers to it. They get like 2 times more information from that employee than they do from the private employee. Then maybe that means that they only need one supervisor per like 8 apartments. But in the private market, it's like 1 per 12 or 1 per 16, right? Something of that order. I'm sorry, I think I said that incorrectly. So I was saying it's 1 per 8 in the publicly owned one, but it
Yeah,
should be
I
like,
get what you
yeah,
mean. I get what you
it should be like 1 per 4, right? The other way. So I guess the question then is like of how much you need to pay for enforcement. There's this related issue where the state basically doesn't know how much racial discrimination there is in hiring in the United States because we don't have like a federal hiring repository. The only way that the state knows that there's hiring discrimination is if you report that hiring discrimination and the state takes up your case. And it's very, very hard to prove that sort of thing. And so without that information, it's hard to know what's going on. Whereas if you had these sort of like federal, like if for example, you required people to like register, like say one thing that I like is this really idea. Apparently, is this I don't know if it was Sweden. Is there something called Platsbanken in Sweden? Am I remembering this? Platsbanken.
mean.
Platsbanken.
Yeah, Platsbanken.
Is this something that every private firm has to register their jobs on, or is this just something that they do register their jobs on?
Yeah, Arbetsförmedlingen. Yeah, I found like the job I work currently on that. I don't think it is. I think it's for like if you're like a larger company, then you have to, right?
Mm.
But the thing is, most companies do it willingly, right?
Well, and so I'm saying
Because
I think
it's just a really good way to find a job.
well, and I think that it's beneficial for both. This is actually the classic example of the state being able to make markets more efficient. Rather than having to have a large HR department that's running its own recruitment website that's actively seeking out employees, if the state runs these like central markets of, say, labor, for example, it can actually decrease the search costs for both labor and the firm, and therefore improve both of them. And so I guess to
Yeah, but
me, this is like Platsbanken is like the dream. Require all corporations, or at least, as you say, the large ones, right? Set some like floor and then require all corporations above that just to put their jobs on here. And then you can use that information to then figure out stuff like, say, discrimination, for example. You can work with that information backwards by having set up the state infrastructure in the first place, by not letting it go through stuff like Indeed, by not letting it go through private corporations. That's the analogy that I'm trying to draw.
Yeah, but the thing is that it seems like a lot of this stuff already exists to a very large extent, provided by the private market, anyways. Like for
But the
example,
state doesn't have
every
that
single job
information.
that's on. What do you say?
But the state doesn't have that information. And so to get it, they've got to ask the private company to give it to them, which usually either means money or time. And
No,
time
no,
is
no, no,
money.
no, no, no. No, no. I'm saying that in the same way that the state does it, right? They either do it through asking corporations directly, or corporations just tell them because they want to advertise their jobs. There's
Mhm.
already private corporations that do this already. uh, employers that want to employ people already have a really big incentive to actually send out and advertise that they have positions, right? So in Sweden, we have other things like, for example, Indeed.com, right? Every single job, okay, almost every single job that's on Platsbanken is
Mhm.
already on Indeed, right? Local municipalities advertise on Indeed. Almost every single like employer. Uh, Advertise on Indeed, but we also have things like ledigajobb.se, which is the same thing, and then we also have jobb.blocket, which is also the same thing. It seems like a lot of this stuff already
Job
exists to a
point.
very large extent.
um,
Punt means like point, yeah. And then we
yeah.
have like Metro Job and Job
So
Point
Indeed
now. Yeah.
Indeed is an international corporation. There's Indeed in my country, and in fact, like I have tried to get jobs on Indeed. So I agree that these exist. I think what you're not getting is, or maybe you're not getting, or I'm not explaining. The difference between something like Platsbanken is that the state has the information of who hired what and who that employee is. So, for example, a big problem in the United States is job discrimination. There's this big fear, and it seems very well justified, that employers discriminate against employees of certain races. In particular, is a big one, and also of employees of certain sexes. Particularly, non-whites tend to get discriminated against. Criminals tend to get discriminated against. Women tend to get discriminated against. And the state doesn't know how much. The only way we know is when academics do studies on this. But if you have a central repository, it makes it one step easier to get that information. Because instead of Sweden, like the Swedish government, trying to, like let's say that you have a civil rights commission. Instead of the civil rights commission going to Indeed and saying, hey, pretty please, could you give us this information on who applied for what job? They just already have it. It's already in Platsbanken. They can just go download the data. And
Okay,
yeah.
I think that maybe you think that Platsbanken works a little bit different than it does, because most of it isn't you don't register through that site. They just send you a link to the registration. So for example, Platsbanken
Well,
will
sure.
send me
Then
to like Indeed, and they'll just send me to the company's website. You don't really have like an account with your
Well, then
social
clearly
security number
Platsbanken
and
isn't
thing
going
like
far enough. Okay, we need a Platsbanken
maybe.
too.
I mean,
Okay.
like maybe I can definitely see like something good with that, right? But it seems like there's so many other ways in which people do apply for jobs anyway, so I don't really know how useful Platzmunken
Well,
will actually
so
be.
I'm not trying to disagree. Maybe this is unclear. So I'm not trying to disagree that private companies do the same thing. The question is simply whether, let's say the state does it, and let's say that there's even an efficiency loss. We will grant that the state is like 1% worse or something at getting people the job they want to get, right? Um, However, there's an information gain. So, for example, before we were talking about the quality of housing units, right? And so the example I'm trying to get at is the quality of job assignment to some degree. It's the level of discrimination in job assignment. And the idea is that were Platzblanken to basically require pre-registration of jobs. If you want to hire someone, you put the job here, and then after you get the job, you tell the state who you hired, which the state can also figure out via tax records anyway. But if you require them to do all that, that data is there. They have it one step. And so basically, the question is like, what additional benefit does having this additional layer of like private corporation have, unless there's some huge efficiency gain? Yeah, I guess that's the fundamental question. Like, assuming no efficiency loss, why not have the state be able to have access to this sort of information?
I mean, like, sure, that's completely fine. I mean, like, it's still like as you said, it's existing alongside markets. It's not replacing markets. It's not like market distortions. It's just like better organization. But I mean, like, at that point, you're talking about something that's fundamentally different from what Platzbanken actually
Well,
is,
sure, I was just
right?
pointing to Platzbanken because I really liked it, okay? But it needs to go further, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, like, sure, I mean, I think that like we can do something like that. That sounds good. But at the same time, it's kind of like however much you want to go further with Platzbanken, there's so many other ways and people actually get jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like LinkedIn exists. A lot of people just get connections through LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like I don't know how useful that information would actually be if a lot of people are getting jobs in other ways, anyways.
Well,
You know, and like
to
since
make
it's online, would have like a demographic bias towards like younger people that are more like tech savvy.
well, so I guess my proposal is for a pre-registration Platzbanken. Do you know what like pre-registration means for like scientific studies?
No,
So so for example, in the United States, you can pre-register a study with I believe the National Institute for Health and Medicine, the NHIM, but I'm not sure. It's one of those institutes. And so what people will do is before they do a social study, before they do like
right,
a medical study, they will tell this institution, "Hey, I'm going to do a medical study." And the goal for doing this is then that institute can one condition government grants to you based on whether you're actually doing that study, which is like an information gain. But two, they can also make sure that you
Wake up,
actually publish
Libra.
the results
I
of that
love you.
study. And the goal there is there's a whole lot of biases in science towards publishing certain kinds of results. Scientists tend to want to publish really positive or really negative results, and they tend to underpublish results near zero. Basically, a boring
right,
study like we found no effect of this drug.
right.
And I know I'm going on a long one, but the basic idea is that when you do pre-registration, you know that you're getting all of the studies. The analogy is, what if instead of pre-registering studies and therefore knowing that we got the entire universe of every study attempted, you were forced to pre-register jobs? Is this sort of analogy?
Wait, how would you pre-register jobs?
So let's say a company wants to like get someone for their job. They've just got to put it on this website,
Right,
and even if they've got it through some like connection on LinkedIn, they got to put the job on the website, and they got to tell you who they gave that job to, and that's it. Like they got to pre-register it so that the government knows every job given, and that provides the government like a true universe of everyone who was hired, which can help you estimate stuff like discrimination.
I mean, like, sure, but at that point, we're talking about like systems. Like, obviously, you're not trying to point to anything. Like, you're not even 100% committed to it. But it kind of seems like I've never seen something like that play out in real life. So I'd be interested to see how that would actually like be
Well,
applied.
time to move to Sweden.
And
Okay, I'm getting a job in Platzblanken, boys. Okay,
oh my god, bro, just the way you're saying it, bro. Okay,
in Platzblanken.
listen, listen, bro. I don't think I'm necessarily against something like that. It just kind of
Wake
seems
up,
like
Libra.
there's like probably
I love you.
better ways that we could tackle discrimination. Probably different things that we can do that I don't know, it just seems like a lot of focus on, like, such a small detail that seems to have,
Well,
like, not
it's not
that many important upsides, right? So it seems like discrimination currently in Sweden, a lot of like some of the biggest problems is like intra-labor union discrimination,
Hmm.
right? Our labor unions in Sweden, the representatives themselves are like social democrats, right? But a lot of the members are racist as fuck, right?
I don't doubt
Like the
that.
second largest, yeah. So it's a lot of people that vote within like it's like the second largest political party within our largest labor union is SDS, Sverigedemokraterna, the
Yeah,
nationalist,
the
like
the
xenophobic. Yeah,
racists.
yeah, exactly. So it seems like if we really want to tackle discrimination, there's probably better ways to do that within pre-existing institutions and kind of thinking up of new systems that we could perhaps do in the future.
Well, so I guess the way I'm thinking about this is not as this being the optimal way to tackle discrimination, but as being an additional benefit of a state run labor market. And so the analogy is for housing, right? I guess to try and pivot back towards there, the one additional benefit of a state run housing market, if we assume that efficiency gains are small or negligible,
Right.
is that then the state has more information. And so, for example, if we want to take the discrimination example, the state knows, assuming that the employee files paperwork correctly, the state knows who applies to be a tenant at like a given building. They know who actually gets the position. So you know whether there's housing discrimination, which is another big thing that's a big problem in the United States. And so I'm proposing this not as like the best solution. Probably there are better solutions, but it's like something that you gain with very little additional cost. It's like a free lunch sort of thing. That's the argument.
Yeah, but it just sort of seems like you could probably, I don't know, you could really do that in a lot of like probably easier ways, right? So it seems like increased funding towards like specialized courts or specialized like organizations that deal with like discrimination within housing, trying to kind of like encourage people to actually like go to the appropriate authorities when they feel like they've been discriminated in terms of housing, right? They can better kind of like records just like on this stuff could probably already exist under the current framework than having to like have public housing because you want this information, right? Like I don't know, it just seems like you could recreate a lot of the same effects without having to have, like, a really drastic change in, like, housing policy.
Oh, so I guess the how do I put this? Um, so to draw an analogy to yeah, I guess I shouldn't open mail on stream. Good point. Um, did I dox myself? Oh no. Well, I guess I'll have to hide the VOD or whatever. The basic thing that I'm trying to point to is I'm trying to think of how to say this. So one of the arguments for like preventative housing is that you can stop people from getting into really dire situations before they even get there, right? Um, and so the analogy is, what if you can stop discrimination without having to go through the whole legal process? Because the legal process is complicated, time consuming, and expensive, right? And so like we have to assume that there's one a loss of like people who actually go to through to the discrimination thing, and two, there's a loss of so one, you don't get as many cases as there actually is discrimination, so like underrepresentation, and two, you get only people who are willing to put themselves through the time and effort to do so. So you get an unrepresentative sample, because it's actually going to be to tend to be the people who are most well off, who are actually going to have the time and incentive and money to go through this sort of like civil rights dispute process. Rather than like the worst off people who are probably the most hurt by discrimination. So I guess that's the sort of argument there, that you want a more
It
proactive
could
than responsive stance.
it could be. I mean, like, I think that fundamentally I'm maybe perhaps just sorry, slightly just more government skeptical than you are, and that's not in the like the libertarian way, just kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I tend to think of like, oh, is there possible ways that we can have like markets and like individuals like do this better, like more effective?
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like if the government, like, let's say your I tend to think of like, hypothetical preferred universe would be like if the federal government were to have this sort of like public housing, right? Take the slack away from like poorly run local municipalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Doesn't it kinda seem like, obviously, if the government's gonna have the power to kinda take care of those sort of, like, housing policies, right? What happens when somebody what happens when somebody kind of like somebody that we don't like, somebody who is reactionary, somebody who is believes in like segregation housing or like low key kind of racist, like take controls of those institutions,
I mean, I guess
right?
the
So what if like a Donald Trump
yeah.
appoints a new like pretty reactionary head of like urban housing and development?
Well, the problem, conversely, is Donald Trump is actually the funniest example because he was literally sued for racial discrimination in housing as a private landlord. Um, so I guess the point is like,
Right, but
go ahead.
yeah, sorry, go on. Sorry. No,
No,
sorry.
well, all I was trying to say is these are things that private actors in the market can do. I understand that the market does, to some degree, discipline people who are racist, right? Because they like lose out on customers. But because the market is so large, right? If we literally in the perfect competition model, right? There are literally infinitely many customers and infinitely many firms. So you choosing to discriminate doesn't actually lose you out on any customers because there's actually an infinite sample of them. And there's so many people who want to rent that you really don't lose out that large of a market by racially discriminating. The market disciplines here are really, really small, but people's racial prejudices
Right.
can be really, really big, I guess is the point. And so I guess I understand that there's a lot of concerns that say like races could get control here. And to me, these all seem like arguments for democratic control, direct democratic control. Like obviously democracy doesn't solve everything, but more direct democratic control can at least mean that like when people are being racist, it's like that everyone gets like a 1-to-1 vote to vote for the racist policy as opposed to like having to vote for a representative who happens to luck into that position like Donald Trump in the United States. And generally, I guess the thing that I would just note is generally it seems like most people tend to favor on direct votes pretty like not in the United States. They tend to favor policies that are economically left of the current situation and socially like a little bit left of the current situation. Direct democracy seems to be like somewhat more liberal, somewhat more leftist than the status quo. I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, like, sure, but I don't even think this is a direct democracy versus like representative democracy conversation either, because it seems like if we're gonna have like direct democracy in terms of like housing policies, it seems like if we're gonna have any sort of like, let's say, your local regional like public housing governor or whatever, right? It seems like there seems to be a lot of places in the United States they're just gonna vote for reactionary people, right? Or they're gonna vote for like pretty reactionary uh like uh like referendums or like single policy elections, right?
So I agree this does happen, but the concern here is that how do I put this? So like one of the arguments that I often have with like people who are revolutionaries is if you had the power to do a revolution, like 60% support or something, you would often have the power to elect
Wake
people
up,
into
neighbor.
office to
I
do the
love
same sort
you.
of policies anyway. And so the analogy backwardsly is if there's enough people to vote for these sorts of policies, there's also probably enough people who are willing to run these like institutions in a racist way. Like for example Donald Trump, right? If there's enough people willing to vote in Donald Trump, probably there are a whole lot of people like Donald Trump running rental properties. And so I guess the way I think about this is that probably the state institution is probably no more discriminatory than the system overall. And there's actually some really interesting evidence that like appointed judges and other like institutions in the United States can be substantially less discriminatory than democracy overall. So it's possible that it's maybe even possible that like direct democracy isn't the best institution, but instead some sort of like civil rights council or something is the best way to overlook these sorts of things because it is genuinely more liberal than the rest of society just institutionally. But I don't know if that's true across the board. This has all gotten a little bit afield from like housing, so I understand that this is like maybe not either of our areas of expertise, but um,
Maybe. I mean, like at this point, right? I've enjoyed this conversation, but it's kind of like we've gone over to like really
yeah,
hypothetical, like what if scenarios, kind of, you know.
sure.
And I think that a lot of the stuff is like, it's obviously really entertaining to talk about, and it's like if we could study like smaller scales of any of these theories more, that'd obviously be super. How do I say? Like nice, you know. I don't want to take up more of your time if you don't want to dwell on like fucking one of the most boring topics, public housing research more, right?
Public
But
housing is so interesting. Shut the fuck up, nerd. Oh my
bro,
god.
it's interesting for people like us, but I can tell you chat is not engaged.
Chat is
Okay?
mega
Listen,
engaged. Chat loves the
how is
housing
chat
conversation.
engaged?
Chat's constantly chat's like, I love this housing debate. I
I,
love
I've been
talk.
reading chat for like 10 minutes. I haven't read the word housing once. Listen.
Um so I think So I guess maybe my closing thoughts is two things. One, someone in chat mentioned that you should talk to Destiny. Does Destiny have a more right wing take on housing than you do?
No, I don't
Wake
think
up,
so.
liberal.
Okay,
Hello.
I think that I'm generally maybe slightly center right towards Destiny on certain issues. I'm not really sure though.
You keep calling yourself center right, and then on Twitter I saw people roasting you for that. So I don't know how true that is.
Okay,
You,
listen.
you're like
Okay, this
you're
might
like
be just because I'm
I want like
Swedish.
vouchers. I want vouchers for fucking public housing. I want like everyone housed. We have public
True,
vouchers. You're like, oh, that's
true.
center right.
Public vouchers
What?
versus like public housing, amazing. No, no. I think I call myself center right because I'm in Sweden,
Mm-hmm.
right?
That's fair.
And it seems like maybe center left in America is center right in Sweden, right?
Probably true.
I call myself center right. I call myself neoliberal-ish, and but it's weird because when I talk like some things that sound really neoliberal here in Sweden, which is like I think that we should adopt the Singaporean model of healthcare in which we have mainly private health and
Disgusting.
providers
Nope, nope. You
under a
better stay with your
national.
beverage model. Nope, nope. Fuck you.
No, no, listen, listen. No, no. I'm just saying that under a national health insurance system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to here in Sweden, oh, you're a fucking neoliberal. Fuck you. Like you're like a Milton Friedman, you know. But then I say that to my friends in America, and they're like, "Yo, bro, you're like a fucking leftist."
Yeah,
And it's
America
like
is very right wing on these
it's
sorts of
crazy.
policies.
Yeah. And I think the only topics I do talk about are the topics which I'm considered quote unquote center left on. So I think that's also why. But
That
trust
could
me,
be.
listen, I'm center right. Okay, come on, trust me.
Well, I'm trusting you very much. So I guess at the end, let's ask for a secondary shill. So why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and where people can find you?
Okay, listen, I do literally nothing. I've been thinking about becoming a content creator for like a few months, but listen, I'm busy working. I'm about to go to
Busy
university.
being
Okay, I have a
high.
Twitter though. I have a Twitter though. If you want to follow that for amazing takes, like certain types of people are hungry, and follow me on twitter.com at mixed_lib. Okay, it's great.
Chris Sneezy says, before you should go, I
Yeah.
should ask you if you supported Sweden's school privatization in the late 2000s.
Okay, first of all, it wasn't late 2000s, it was early 2000s, late 90s, okay? I think that a lot of the problems, like we have a lot of free school or like private housing, it led
Mm-hmm.
to some it led to some problems, right? But however, it kind of seems like a lot of those problems were alleviated after 2014 when we introduced a new national curriculum, and it seems like we're actually again one of the highest scoring countries when you like take the international PISA scales, right? So in 2018, we scored higher in the United States in terms of math and science, and but not English, I think. So yeah, privatization has problems. Mainly has to do with funding rather than just being privately owned. But it seems like we can solve this problem through like changes, like minor changes in terms of funding and national curriculum. But yeah.
Well, I don't know enough about this to talk about this. Chris Sneezy says that I should mention Norway as being better, and I'm sure they are. You disgusting Swede. I'm going to get you off my stream. Thanks for coming on, Mixed.
Oh my god, bro. Oh my god. Sweden is based. Norway's cringe. We should have never given back Norway.
Wait, are you
Okay?
defending imperialism on my stream? Swedish imperialism on my stream over the innocent Nords? I'm pretty sure I have Nordic
Excuse
heritage.
me. Excuse me. It's only imperialism when it's not your country. Norway belongs to us. Okay? That's all I gotta say. Okay?
Okay. Well, have a lovely
Okay, it
evening,
was
Mixed.
nice talking to you, bro. Have a good
Sure.
day.
See you around.
See you, man.
Let's see. Dill Ward says, in the county where I went to high school, the only public high school lost its accreditation largely due to wealthy families abandoning it. As I understand, stratification in privatized school systems is a really big problem, but I don't know I don't know much about the whole school privatization and competition debate. One of the interesting related concepts is whether you could have publicly funded schools with some degree of school choice, rather than fully privatized systems, whether there's some sort of in-between with a high degree of competition, and how much competition actually matters, or whether it's other things which are actually driving any perceived benefits from privatization.